Lindsay, thank you very much, and thank IRI for both honoring the Secretary and honoring me by giving me a chance to be his interrogator tonight. Lindsay usually just introduced me as his favorite communist, but he cleaned it up tonight, you know, on behalf of for this event. But it really is a treat. For those of you who don't know, there's more to my being here tonight than just the fact that I write the Foreign Affairs column for the New York Times. I was the Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times up till 1988, and up till 1982. Then I went to Beirut, and in 1988 they gave me a year off to write a book. I wrote Beirut to Jerusalem, but before that year they said, when you're done with this leave, you're going to come to Washington, D.C. and be the Times chief diplomatic correspondent, and you will cover whoever is the next Secretary of State. And that turned out, to the country's good fortune and my good fortune, to be Secretary of State James Baker. And I had really the height of my journalism reporting career spending those 4 years in the back of the Secretary's plane. I think he traveled 750,000 miles, Jim, something like that. And I was on, I believe, about 700,000 miles of those. So it's great. It's both a great memory and just a great honor to be here this evening. And I thought, you know, we could start, Jim, by just asking you the question that's really been on my mind. You know, how do you think being Secretary of State today is different from when you held this job, you know, back in the early 90s?
Well, of course, I was the last Cold War Secretary of State the country had. And in those days, I tell people it wasn't too difficult to know what our policy ought to be. If the Soviets were for it, we were against it. And if they were against it, we were for it. Although we did have to deal, as you know, with some transnational issues and that sort of thing. But it might have been a bit more simple time. The fact of the matter is, though, that the job of Secretary of State really depends more than anything else on one particular item, and that is what your relationship is with the President of the United States. If you don't have an extremely close relationship with the President of the United States, it's very, very hard for you to succeed as Secretary of State. People ask me all the time, what's the most fun job you had up there in Washington? What's the best job you had up there in Washington? I tell them that Treasury was a wonderful place to be, particularly after being White House Chief of Staff, where your job is to catch the javelins that are intended for the old man, and you walk around with a target on your front and on your back. So Treasury was a wonderful place to be. But with State, everybody in Washington wants a piece of the foreign policy turf. And the only way you can be effective as a Secretary of State is if you have a seamless relationship with your President. And if your President will support you and protect you and defend you even when you make a mistake. Things are different now, primarily because the Cold War is over. We live in a multipolar world today. When I was Secretary of State, we lived in a bipolar world. And then, to my great good fortune, and I think the good fortune of the country, for a period of time we lived in a unipolar world. And I believe that one of the reasons we were able to get a number of things accomplished in a 3.5 to 4 year time span was attributable more than anything else to two things. One, my really tight relationship with President George H.W. Bush. Everybody knew I had run all of his campaigns, that we'd been friends for 40 years. Nobody was going to get between me and my president, and so that made it very easy for me to get some things done. And then we had a congruence of events where we were the preeminent. Absolutely, we're still the preeminent power in the world. But at that time, with the collapse of communism, the end of the Cold War, the implosion of the Soviet Union, everybody wanted to get close to Uncle Whiskers. And we could do pretty much anything we wanted, and we did.
You know, it reminds me of a story I've told people before. We were on a trip with you. It was right after Madrid. I think we went to Central Asia. And we went to Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I don't know if you remember this, but at the press conference in Azerbaijan, a reporter stood up. You had just put together the Madrid peace deal. And a reporter stood up and said, Mr. Secretary, now that you've done that, would you like to come mediate in Nagorno-Karabakh? You know, and I remember you kind of winking at me. And that was not high on your priority list. But it did show you that one of the things I really learned from following you, Jim, was that success breeds success, and success breeds authority, and authority breeds more success. Correct. And we haven't had that kind of role, you know, for a long time, it seems. The other thing that really struck me, though, and I don't know if this is just my imagination, but it seemed that the general foreign policy national security team under Bush 41 was unusually collegial in comparison to teams before and after. Is that just my imagination?
No, I don't think it is, Tom. And I wrote in my book, The Politics of Diplomacy, about my 4 years as Secretary of State, that I think we were the exception to the rule. And there were a couple of reasons for that, but the primary reason was the character of our president. He knew foreign policy, he knew how the national security apparatus was supposed to work, and he saw to it that it worked that way. And we didn't leak on each other, we didn't stab or fight, and therefore we were able to get some things done.
How did you manage it?
Now that's not to say that there weren't a lot of problems, a lot of differences. There are always differences between state and defense, as you know. But I'll bet you that Dick Cheney and I never took more than 4 issues to the president for resolution. We would work them out. We had a Wednesday morning breakfast every Wednesday morning in the National Security Advisor's office, in Brent's office. And we would each come armed with talking points from our respective bureaucracies that laid out that bureaucracy's position, and we'd usually throw them away and work out the problem. We ended up taking maybe only 3 or 4 issues to the president. And so I think that was really, really very important, and an important contributor to whatever success we had.
Also, just in terms of the public space and being trying to manage the public side of it, and you had a great deputy in Margaret to help you with that, but there were no bloggers then, no Twitter.
No,
there was barely even CNN, was there?
That's right. We didn't. We had CNN. If you recall, the cable companies were just surfacing at that time, and I never will forget going back maybe 8 years when I was chief of staff in the first Reagan term. We had press pool, and the pool TV was always one of the major networks, NBC, ABC, or CBS. And one day I got a call from a guy named Ted Turner who said he wanted to come see me. And I said, fine. And so we scheduled an appointment. He came in, he said, we want you to put CNN in the pool. I said, are you kidding? We're not going to put this dinky little cable operation and he said, if you don't put us in the pool, we're going to sue you. And I said, well, we know where the courthouse is. We'll see you there. And they sued us and they beat us. And so after that, everybody was in the rotation, including CNN. But no, you certainly didn't have the internet, of course, and the bloggers, and where people could throw stuff up and see what sticks in the wall. And so didn't have that. We didn't have the proliferation of media outlets, and so we were able better to articulate a coherent and coordinated and directed message.
Let's go to some of the hot spots around the world, and one that you really cut your teeth on, the Middle East. Do you think the two-state solution is over?
No, I don't think. I hope the two-state solution is not over, because I don't see any other solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is extremely critical, in my view, for Israel, particularly, to find a way to achieve peace with its neighbors. And there's no basis that I know of that can be accomplished other than land for peace and a two-state solution. So I really hope that it's not over. I probably shouldn't tell you. I make an enemy of you for life if I tell this story on you. But it was Tom Friedman who first suggested to me. We were flying back somewhere, and we'd been beating our head against the wall on the Arab-Israeli dispute, and I think Shamir had just decided he was going to let his government collapse rather than let one Palestinian who had a second apartment in Jerusalem serve on the Palestinian delegation. And Tom, and we're flying back, and he said, you know, you can't want it more than they do. You've got, you know, at some point you've just got to say, look, when you get serious, let us know. So I'm up there testifying on the Hill, and this congressman from California is beating up on me about the collapse of our effort, which was due primarily to Shamir and not to us. Really beating up on President George Bush. The guy's name was Mel Levine. I'll never forget it. And I looked at him finally and said, let me tell you something, Mel. You tell your friends over there when they get serious about peace, call us. Here's the telephone number. And I gave him the telephone number of the White House because I hadn't been at State that long, and I knew the White House telephone number, but I didn't know the State Department. Well, I want to tell you something. The switchboards were flooded. And I got a call from President Bush. He said, Bake, what are you doing? He said, I said, I'm sorry if I created any problem. He said, you might want to send flowers to the White House operators.
But Jimmy, what can we do in the meantime?
We can't do much for now, right now, Tom. I mean, we're not, politics is a reality. And of course, you know, politics impacts policy, and no more so than in the Arab-Israeli dispute. We've got an election coming up. Nothing's going to be done for a year for sure. But there are two other conditions, I think, that need to be met. One is that we need to find a way to have a unified Palestinian polity. Mm-hmm. You can't negotiate peace with half the Palestinians. You can't negotiate peace with Fatah, not Hamas, or Hamas, not that Fatah. Or so they've got to find a way for there to be a unified Palestinian position, you know, a unified Palestinian security service, and all the rest. And the third thing that needs to be done is we need to get a government in Israel, quite frankly, that wants to lean forward for peace, the way Yitzhak Rabin's government did. And he leaned forward for peace, and a lot of progress was made in those days. So those are the three things that need to be done before I think we don't need another failure now. I would caution the policymakers against trying to generate something now which was going to fail. The last thing we need is another failure. But when those three conditions are met, we get past our election, we get a unified Palestinian polity, and we can do some things with the Egyptians to make that happen, and get a government in Israel that's going to lean forward for peace. And that will come, because the vast majority of Israeli body politic are very tired of being a nation perpetually at war.
What did you learn as a you came into the job, you had a lot of experience negotiating, but the Middle East always tests you, in particular, as a negotiator. What's your advice, what's been your advice to your successors in how to be a successful negotiator in that part of the world?
Well, I don't think that part of the world is a whole lot different than others. I think one of the cardinal rules of negotiating, there's several, but one is find out if you can trust the guy across the table or the lady across the table, whatever it might be. If you can develop a relationship of trust, you don't compromise your principles to any degree or extent, but if you can trust the person who you're talking to, and they can trust you, you got a lot better chance of getting there. And there are ways to test that. The other thing I think that's extremely critical is to know what the political constraints are on your interlocutor. Know what his or her limits are. Yeah. If you know that and you're conscious of that going in, you have a better chance. And then, of course, the old saw about carrots and sticks. I mean, there are carrots, particularly when you're the United States of America, and there's sticks when you're the United States of America.
You know, the big headline, every morning we wake up now and we hope that, you know, Greeks have paid their taxes, or Italians have, come to work that morning. And
don't hold your breath.
That's right. We live in this amazingly integrated world, but, you know, put on your Secretary of Treasury hat for us, Jim. What is your sense of, can the European Union hold? How do you see this playing out?
I think the European Union will. I'm not so confident about the the single currency. I remember when I was Treasury Secretary, the position of the United States at that time was to support monetary union, because it would be so much better if we could just deal with one big E than deal with 15 different countries. Now there's 24, 27, whatever it is. But we used to say privately a lot, we don't see how this is going to work. You got 15 fiscal policies and one monetary policy. What's the monetary policy going to be of the European Central Bank when France is booming and Germany's in the tank, or vice versa? And Europeans came to us and said, we're going to take care of that because we're going to have a stability pact where everybody will agree to observe certain fiscal restrictions and responsibilities. And they signed the stability pact, but then they promptly breached it, every one of them, including the people who were pushing for the union. The monetary union came about, it's interesting, it came about because Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, wanted to unify Germany. And we didn't have a very big window of opportunity to get that done. With President Bush's leadership, and he was committed to this, we got it done over the objections of France, England, and the Soviet Union. We got Germany unified in a very narrow window. Kohl wanted that badly. Mitterrand, on the other hand, wanted a single currency, wanted a big E, Europe. And so they cut a deal. And Kohl, in effect, said, look, I'll support the single currency if you'll support unification of Germany. But there's always been a problem with the single currency, because how do you coordinate 15 fiscal policies and one monetary policy? So unless they get real about letting countries that go bankrupt fail, they're going to have to let some of these countries go. And then they're going to have to find a way to have a stability pact that they live by. Otherwise, it's going to be very, 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 very dicey going forward. And, we're now looking at Italy. Boy, if Italy goes down, we're going to feel it over here big time, big time. And Italy's too big to bail out.
Yeah. It reminds me the press conference announcing the 2+4, the German Unification Treaty. All the foreign ministers were up there, and they gave every member of the press an English translation of the treaty. And so as each one came down, I got each one to sign it, except one, the East German, and Margaret got that for me. So I have the only other signed copy of the German Unification Treaty.
Well, that's wonderful. Maybe you can trade it for them for some discipline.
If you see it on eBay, you'll know where it came from. Jim, Arab Spring, of all the things that seemed so unlikely when you were Secretary of State, but now is playing out across that region, is this Arab awakening.
Right.
How do you see it playing out?
Well, I'm not sure we know. I think there's there are a lot of open questions about it. Hopefully it will, and I think there's a good chance of this, so hopefully it will lead to more democracy, more freedom for the individual, more freedom for those countries, more economic stability, more social justice. If that's the way it unfolds, boy, will that be good. And that would really be positive for the Arab-Israeli problem. That's what I think could happen in the medium to long term. I'm semi-pessimistic about the short term, and I don't think that it's a healthy development right now in terms of Israel's prospects in the short term. We don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. Tunisia's looking pretty good. There still could be a very positive result in Egypt, and we ought to all hope and pray for that. I said there's not much chance of doing anything on the Arab-Israeli dispute right now, but there are a few things we need to be doing. One is to be working with the Israelis and the Palestinians to pacify Gaza if we can. Right. Keep the conflict there down. We need to make sure that the Egypt Israeli peace treaty doesn't blow up, because if that blows up, it'll blow up any chances for Arab-Israeli peace. So there's some things we need to continue to fund the Palestinian National Authority. Now there's going to be a big move. Maybe it's already there, Senator. I don't know, to defund them. That would be a dumb thing for us to do. That would play into the hands of the radicals, and it would penalize the moderates. So hopefully we won't do that. But I think the jury is probably still out. And having said all that, I think the administration is doing a reasonably good job, in my view, of relating to the events in the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring. You know, that it could be that they have to end up adopting a double standard. There have been worse things in the business of realpolitik. I mean, I don't think you can let the Iranians take over Bahrain, and we have a huge national interest in stability in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I've been in 3 administrations, and every one of them we had it all written down. We would go to war to protect the energy, secure access to the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, and we did so in the Gulf War. I mean, even though we didn't want to talk about that was the reason we were doing it. It was one of the main reasons we did it.
You know, there's a common saw you hear out there these days that Britain owned the 19th century, America owned the 20th century, and China is sure to own the 21st century. How do you feel about that?
I don't think I'm not the least bit pessimistic about America, although I am very depressed about our debt situation. But if we deal with this big debt bomb we got out here and deal with it positively, and by the way, I agree with you in your new book in terms of immigration, infrastructure, education, R&D, and that sort of thing, those pillars you cited, we need to rebuild those. But I think America is going to be the preeminent power in the world for certainly the rest of my lifetime, and maybe the rest of the lifetime of a lot of younger people here. And I'm just not, I just don't think we need to cede our leadership role to China. Now, I know you take a poll in Europe, and a lot of people think China has already surpassed the United States as the #1 economy in the world, but it isn't. Their GDP is 50 times smaller than ours, and there's no reason why they will, provided we get rid of our debt bomb. And we got to figure out the way to do that, and in my view, there's only one way to do it, and that's ultimately some big grand bargain between the parties where we, yes, raise some revenues, but also mostly cut spending. Ronald Reagan used to always say, you know, he said, Americans are not undertaxed, we overspend. And we do, and we're still overspending. Spending today is 25% of GDP. Historically, it's been 20%. And when I say raise revenues, I mean raise revenues with legally enforceable spending restraint. It doesn't do any good to raise revenues and stop there, because the Congress, pardon me, Senator, but you know it, and you would vote against it, but the Congress will take that money, put it in its pocket, and spend some more. So if you're going to use revenues to try and get the debt bomb reduced, you got to make sure you have legally enforceable spending restraint as a part of that.
You know what? The first time I ever visited China was when you went after Tiananmen Square. It was the first trip to repair.
Not a fun trip.
Exactly. I remember, in fact, sitting in the bus for 8 hours at the Daiwatai. We ordered Pizza Hut, you know, waiting for you to come out, and we weren't sure they were going to let you go.
I wasn't either.
What was it like negotiating with the Chinese, and how in any way is that different, you know, from any of the other hard people you had to negotiate with?
Well, the Chinese are really tough, and I had to negotiate with that lovely fellow called Li Peng.
That's
you
right.
remember him?
I sure do. That's right.
He was tough as nails.
Yeah.
But they're not, you know, they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like we do, and they're no different. They're tough negotiators. What I found interesting about going to China, first trip I took to China was with Ronald Reagan. No, first trip I took was as a private citizen way back in 1977, when there were no cars in Beijing, just bicycles. Everybody had on Mao jackets. But then I went in 1982 with Ronald Reagan. We stayed at the Daiwatai guest house, and we started checking for bugs. Every light switch had a bug under it. Not just some of them, but every light switch. We go back there years later, when I'm Secretary of State, every light switch has a bug under it. But they're tough negotiators, but there's no reason why we need to cede a leadership role to them, provided we get our economic house in order. You can't be strong politically, diplomatically, or militarily if you're weak economically. And they are a strong economy, and we should give credit where credit's due. What they've done economically is really one of the most amazing things, most amazing economic transformations in world history. But they're still far behind us in many respects. They still have problems. They got a big housing problem. They're going to have some political problems coming down the road. They have a very poor rural population, a lot of affluence in the urban areas. And as far as hegemonistic tendencies on the part of China is concerned, we keep the Seventh Fleet out there for a good reason. But in addition to that, we have strong alliances that China doesn't have. We've got strong alliances with Japan and South Korea. We're building one with India, where you've just come from. And by the way, guess what another country out there that might be on our side would be? Vietnam. How about that? And Indonesia. So there's a lot of things I think that we can do should China attempt to become hegemonistic in that part of the world. So my view on China is we have a lot of areas in which we can cooperate with China on trade, on terrorism, on stability in that part of the world. But we have a lot of differences too, on Tibet, on Taiwan, on Iran. So what we need to do is cooperate with China where we can, because we have a big interest in the best possible relationship that we can have with them, and they have a similar interest with us. Cooperate where we can, where we have differences, manage those differences. And we can do that. The one thing we really ought to try to avoid doing is believing that China is an enemy. China is not our enemy today. We could make her our enemy if we started a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we ought not to do that. That would be a major mistake for us.
You alluded to something earlier, Jim, which is that we need a grand bargain. This combination of spending cuts and revenue increases we can get in a number of ways.
Spending on everything, entitlements and everything else.
And polls show that as well, that's where the center of the country is. But the center of the political spectrum seems to be missing since your tenure with Bush 41. What happened there? How did we get it back?
Well, the center it's sort of a disappearing center, isn't it? I mean, we seem to be more and more captive to the partisans on the left or the partisans on the right. Now, why is that happening? Well, one reason, I think, is the redistricting process, where the party that's in power in the state legislatures creates safe districts. Safe districts lead to more radical incumbents, and whether it's whether it's the left for the Democrats or right for Republicans.
Because the primary becomes the real election.
That's it. Primary. Yeah, there are very few seats that are competitive, and that's one of the problems. And then I also think the proliferation of media outlets and the rise of the internet. Fighting seems to be popular. The divisiveness sells. Comity doesn't sell. And how many times you turn on your TV and you see nothing, see these talking heads barking at each other, and I just turn it off, and I can't watch that. But the center seems to be weaker today than it used to be in our politics. When I came up with Jerry Ford and then with Ronald Reagan was. I call him a principled pragmatist because he would never sacrifice principle, but boy, did he know how to cut a deal. And he did. And he understood that we grade our presidents on the basis of how much of their program they can get through the Congress. Right. Well, to get your program through the Congress, you're going to have to shave here and there. Compromise shouldn't be a dirty word. It's how we used to govern. And it's how you govern when you govern from a bipartisan point of view. So I don't know but beyond that, I don't know how to answer your question.
You alluded just a second ago to Iran, and I can't think of a more vexing problem today than the Iran problem and being on the cusp of nuclearization, weaponized nuclearization. How do you think about that problem? How do you think we should deal with it?
Well, I think it's a really difficult problem, as you do. I think if Iran got the bomb, it would be an extraordinarily unfortunate circumstance because primarily, not so much because it would threaten Israel or the United States, but primarily because it would set off an arms race in that part of the world. Saudi Arabia would then have to get it. Turkey would have to get it. Egypt might have to get it. So it would really be very, very bad. I'm one who believes that that these Ayatollahs may be flaky and crazy, and they probably are, but I think they have a serious sense of self-preservation. And I think that if we made it really clear to them that if they got the bomb, let's suppose they get it, we can't stop them from getting it. By the way, there are a lot of things that still could be done, I think, if we could get the Russians particularly, and the Chinese, to crank up sanctions. If you cut off gasoline imports into that country, you'd really hurt them. Or there's some other financial things that we could do if we could get China and Russia to go along. But let's suppose they get the bomb. I don't think that we ought to just say, well, contain. Then it's military or nothing. That's not I don't believe that to be the case. Containment worked for 40 years against the Soviet Union. Because they knew if they did so much as blinked at us that we would wipe them off the face of the earth. And I think one phone call to the head Ayatollah over there saying, hey, pal, you need to understand, if you even so much as blink at Israel or at us, we have 3,500 strategic nukes. And by the way, 20 seconds ago, they were just aimed on you. and I think they would understand that. And I think containment could work. You know, I don't know what the results of a military strike would be, either in terms of whether it would work. Right. Nobody seems to me to really know the answer to that. The results are sort of uncertain. I know that the results in the region would be negative in terms of empowering. You'd empower the radicals in Iran, and they're beginning to have trouble in Iran. Their populace is beginning to give them trouble. You ought not to empower them. And of course, it would set off untold other consequences in the region. So, and you know, I believe this to be true. I think that since 2007, in terms of an Israeli strike now, the question is, well, okay, we don't do it. We give Israel a green light. My sense is that's a mistake. That's not in the national interest of the United States. Now, you won't get any Republican running for president to say that, and I've been in politics long enough to understand that, but it would be a mistake, in my view, for us to do that. And it's interesting to me that request was made by Israel of both the Bush 43 administration and the Obama administration since 2007 for overflight rights, in-flight refueling capability, and bunker-busting bombs. Now I think we've done the bunker-busting bombs, but I don't believe we've done the other. Yeah. So both those administrations evidently took the position it would not be in the national interest of the United States. It's a tough issue. It's a very difficult issue.
What do you think of Rick Perry's future?
I thought we were talking about foreign policy.
We are. I couldn't resist tossing that one.
Oh, that's a good one. I like it. I like that one very much.
I forgot my question.
I've said publicly before, and I'll say it again, I think that Romney would be our strongest candidate in the fall. And I said this at a fundraiser I did for Senator Hatch, because he's had private sector business experience. He's been a hands-on businessman, for one reason. And for the second reason, to win a general election, you've got to win the independent voters in the swing states. Those swing states are Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida. And I think Mitt Romney would probably appeal to those independent voters more so than any of the other people running on our side.
Let me conclude, Jim, by saying that I've written this, and I really do believe you were our last consequential Secretary of State. And I think that is not just about the times, but about the incredible skill you brought to the job. It was amazing being in the back of that plane. I just have amazing memories, whether it was you poking, your head for the first time through a crack in the Berlin Wall, or seeing 100,000 Albanians, turn out into the streets, or being the pool reporter when you took Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, on a trip to Wyoming, first time ever. One of my favorite memories is when we went to Chelyabinsk, behind the Urals,
Chelyabinsk, yeah,
visiting the Russian Los Alamos. And I remember we stayed in a hotel that night, and I got in the elevator, and the elevator buttons went, this is in the Los Alamos of Russia. The elevator buttons went 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 3. And honest to God, and I was on the 3rd floor, and if you pressed the 3 at the top, you ended up on the 3rd floor. And I saw that, and I thought, we've won the Cold War. This is just...
That's right.
So this,
Right.
I knew it was over then.
Do you remember, the one thing you might have forgotten was I was the last high-ranking official to meet with Gorbachev just before he resigned. He left on Christmas Day in 1991. So I go to the Soviet Union, and I go over to the Kremlin to meet with Gorbachev, and I'm ushered in, and there he is sitting there with nobody with him except Shevardnadze and Chernyayev, his national security advisor. The defense minister of Russia, of the Soviet Union, was not there. Well, an hour later, I'm to meet with Yeltsin, and I think I'm going to go over to the White House, the Russian Federation building, to meet with Yeltsin, where we always used to meet with Yeltsin. No, the call comes, we're going to meet in St. Catherine's Hall in the Kremlin. So just to stick it in Gorbachev's eye, you remember. And Yeltsin comes in, he's got the Soviet Union's defense minister and a whole array of military people with him. And he pulls me aside at the beginning of the meeting. He says, I want to talk to you. And he said, but I don't want your interpreter in this meeting. So he gets his interpreter, and we go into a private room. He said, I want to tell you how they just formed the Commonwealth of Independent States, composed of all of the former republics of the former Soviet Union. I want to tell you how the nuclear system is going to work in the Commonwealth of Independent States. He said, you know, we have strategic nuclear weapons in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. He said, so we're going to give the presidents, I'm president of Russia, we're going to give the presidents of each one of those countries buttons, launch buttons. He said, but mine's the only launch button that'll work. And I thought that, I said, that's when I knew the Cold War was over. Here he is, he's telling the American Secretary of State how they're going to handle the nuclear launches of the nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. And they gave these guys dummy buttons.
Well, you know, just to conclude, you know, as I said, I have amazing memories from the back of the plane. I can only imagine what memories you have from the front of the plane. And besides the phony buttons, when you think back, you know, on those remarkable, you know, 3 3/4 years, what event, what person, what encounter, what really sticks in your mind most? Is there one meeting, one session,
you
one
know,
person?
it was such a time of fundamental change. Yeah. The world as we had known it all of our adult lives changed in those 4 years. You know, right. For my generation particularly, and all we'd known was the Cold War. It ended. And then you had all of these other remarkable developments. First time Israel and all of its Arab neighbors ever sat down face to face to negotiate peace. The Arabs changed 40 years of policy because of the stature and status of the United States at the time. And so it was an incredible time to be Secretary of State. As I mentioned, it was the beginning of a very short period of the unipolar world where it was just us and nobody else. And it was quite an honor to be able to represent the country at that time and in that context. But if you ask me what one single event, it's pretty hard. There were so many of them that were so important, but I never will forget coming off the meeting with Tariq Aziz in Geneva in the lead up to the first Gulf War. And President Bush really wanted the world to know that we were not just going to war just to go to war, that we were going to exhaust every possible opportunity to see if there was a way to get to peace without negotiating down from the UN Security Council resolution that said you get out of Kuwait and you get out unconditionally. So we had a 7 or 8 hour meeting, and there are two things about that I want to say. One is that I told the foreign minister of Iraq at that meeting, I said, if you use, we knew Saddam had chemical weapons. I said, if you use weapons of mass destruction against our forces, the American people will demand revenge, and we have the means to exact it. I said, that's not a threat, Mr. Minister. It is a promise. And then after they captured Saddam, they debriefed him. They said, why didn't you use your chemical weapons? He said, because of what Baker told Aziz in Geneva, which just makes the point that there are things that we can do with this power that we have if we do it adroitly. And the other thing was the time that does stick in my mind so much in the aftermath of that meeting. I flew immediately to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. I don't know whether you were on the trip or not. And I addressed the pilots who were going to be carrying out the first strike. And I knew, of course, only one or two people that knew when we were going to start the war. I knew it. Brent knew it. President Bush, of course. And I addressed those pilots. And I knew they were going to be in the first wave of, and you know, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world, and we weren't sure what the casualties were going to be. We weren't sure we were going to get off with as few as we did. And I never will forget the patriotism and the strength and the confidence of those kids saying, you know, they kept asking me, saying, I never will forget, one of them said, you know, Mr. Secretary, he said, when are we going to either get to, they'd been there 6 months in the desert, when are we either going to get to go home or kick butt? And I knew they were going to get to kick butt about 5 days later, and I was worried about whether all of them would come back. Every last one of them came back. But that was a time that I will really never forget, and a time that I was so very proud of this country.
Well, Jim, we are Well, let me simply say, on behalf of the people who were in the back of the plane, we were glad you were in the front of the plane. Secretary of State Baker, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.